Good afternoon and welcome to today's program presented by the Commonwealth Club Silicon Valley and the Computer History Museum. My name is John Hollar. I'm the museum's president and CEO. Our guest today is FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler. For more than 3 decades, Tom has been involved with new telecommunications networks and services. He's experienced the telecommunications revolution as a policy expert, as an advocate, and as a businessman. He is also a published historian, and he has served this country for many years with distinction on the boards of the Foundation for the National Archives and the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington. The FCC's approach to regulation, technology, innovation, and market growth is of critical importance to Silicon Valley and to the nation. And this will be the first opportunity for West Coast audiences to hear from Tom personally since his confirmation. He's fresh from the Consumer Electronics Show and freshly installed in his position in Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Tom Wheeler.
You know, I've had the privilege of knowing John Hollar for a long time when he was once a senior staffer at the FCC. I can't, this institution doesn't need my input, but my golly, what a great decision they made when they brought you on as CEO, John.
Well, thank you very much, Tom.
And John gave me a tour today, and no offense, folks, but I'd rather be downstairs looking at the exhibits than up here talking to you. There is really exciting, really cool stuff. I also want to call out and to say hello to a group of friends who have surprised me to be here. Kevin Surace, who I once worked with when he had this crazy idea that data could move over wireless networks and built a company around it. Mark Gorenberg, who had the crazy idea that he could convince the President of the United States that there ought to be such a thing as spectrum sharing. And my great friend, Steve Millard, who I've known since the middle of the 1980s, one of the great entrepreneurs and innovators out here in the Valley. And to see all you here and to be surprised with your attendance means a lot. I've been in the Valley a lot in my career, but this, as John indicated, is my first trip here as the chairman of the FCC. There can be no better venue than here at the museum. And
we're going to escort her out too, please.
And I'm grateful to John and to the Commonwealth Club for this invitation. Nearly 200 years ago, the British mathematician Charles Babbage exclaimed, "I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam." And he went on to conceptualize the engine that drives today's network revolution. Although Babbage never built what he called his difference engine, the concept of a machine capable of performing mathematical calculations was so spot on, and his blueprints for doing this were so precise that over 150 years later, what can be called the first computer was assembled here at the Computer History Museum. And it worked just as Babbage had envisioned 150 years ago. That computational revolution that Babbage forged has today produced history's 4th great network revolution, following those of the printing press, the railroad, and the electronic communications revolution that began with the telegraph. This 4th network revolution is the revolution that you all here in the Valley are leading and will continue to lead. And so that's why I'm very honored to be here today for the second in a series of speeches designed to lay out thoughts on the relationship between the 4th network revolution and the American people. The first such exposition was at The Ohio State University in December, and there I said that the FCC is the public's representative in the ongoing network revolution. And there I offered 2 principles. First, I emphasized the importance of competition. Our competition policy at the FCC is simple. Where competition does exist, we will protect it. Where competition can exist, we will incent it and promote it. And where private markets cannot be expected to deliver what the public needs, then we will proceed in a transparent manner to fill that void. Second, I talked about the importance of what I call the network compact. It has 4 key elements: universal accessibility, reliable interconnection, consumer protection, and public safety and security. One of the things that Silicon Valley clearly exhibits and clearly embraces is the concept of economic risk. It's the lifeblood of innovation and investment. To eliminate risk would be to eliminate growth. But at the same time, there are some risks that are so big that they threaten to block competition and they threaten to block innovation, and thus they block economic growth. Markets won't work where those risks aren't mitigated. That's why, for example, we have binding contracts. When government enforces contracts, business people are able to make deals. Without enforceable contracts, business cannot be conducted. Who would order something online to be delivered tomorrow if there weren't the concept of an enforceable contract? In the realm of the FCC, this means the most familiar counterpart here is radio interference. Who would have invested on a radio station in the 1920s or 30s if there was no guarantee to the listeners, or that listeners would not hear that station's broadcast cluttered and interrupted with the cacophony of other wireless transmissions? So I would like to take a few minutes today to talk about 3 important ways in which the FCC should respond to the kind of pernicious risk that prevents rather than enhances market dynamism. Or to say the same thing a different way, the steps the FCC can take to remove obstacles and to supply inputs, tangible and intangible, to enable innovators to spur growth. First is through spectrum policy that eliminates the risks stemming from the government-mandated misallocation of spectrum. Second, by speeding the transition to all IP networks, by preserving the network compact. And finally, through the protection of the open internet, that is today our largest channel of global commerce. Now, I know that some of you are sitting there saying, oh, this is great. This is another, I'm here from Washington and I'm here to help you. And you're eyeing the exits. Well, bear with me for a minute. For most of the last decade, I was a venture capitalist. I understand how Sand Hill Road and Pennsylvania Avenue sometimes seem to be on different planets. I'm well aware of the skepticism towards government. For this discussion, however, let's stipulate 2 things. Government isn't always as smart as it thinks it is. And neither are entrepreneurs and innovators. What do I mean by this? Simply that because by its very nature, government is risk averse, it cannot and should not micromanage dynamic, technology-driven markets. My agency, for instance, sat on the idea of cellular telephony for a decade. And a commission member at the time even warned that using spectrum for obviously frivolous uses, such as making phone calls, made no sense. At the same time, however, the individuals who are defining our new network revolution are like the proverbial frog on the fence post. They didn't get there by themselves. Microprocessors, packet switching, ARPANET, walking down through the museum today and seeing all the things that were government driven. Those innovations came out of a relationship with the government. And the FCC, I might say, finally got cellular telephony right and created a competitive market. Which brings me back to the first of the three ways the FCC can minimize harmful risk and encourage dynamism and economic growth: the policy governing the use of electromagnetic spectrum. The majority of networks in the future will ride on the air. They may be cellular or Wi-Fi or satellite, or they may be fiber or copper networks that end in Wi-Fi hotspots. The defining characteristic of our fourth network revolution is its untethered nature. The spectrum that enables this untethered connectivity is assigned and allocated by the FCC. Historically, the government allocated spectrum for specific uses or applications. The realities of analog transmission meant that each application, whether television broadcasting or a conversation on a walkie-talkie, required their own assigned chunk of spectrum. As the IP revolution has meant that a voice call looks the same as a television show, a collection of zeros and ones, the analog-inspired spectrum silos have become an impediment to advancement. Put another way, one of the revolutions through which we are now living is the reworking of analog spectrum concepts to the new digital realities. Slavishly sticking to analog age concepts of spectrum allocation can become, in the digital age, a government-imposed choke point that burdens competition and innovation by creating unnecessary and artificial scarcity of this essential resource. The spectrum allocation chart is chock full of allocation decisions made on analog concepts that are no longer valid today. We need to bring more spectrum capacity to market, and fast. We have not had a major spectrum auction since 2008. I'm pleased to say that due to years of effort, the spectrum pipeline is reopening. We have one auction scheduled to begin in less than 2 weeks, on January 22nd. Two other major auctions will follow, the first in the fall of 2014, this year, and the other in mid-2015. And it's that last one, it's called the 600 megahertz auction, that I want to talk about for a minute now. It's an incentive auction where you provide incentive for broadcasters to repurpose their spectrum for other applications. It will repurpose a large swath from broadcast only to more flexible uses, including mobile uses. It will bring together willing sellers of spectrum rights with willing buyers through a two-sided auction. Technology makes it practicable, the marketplace makes it profitable, and the FCC, through its rules and auction design, makes it possible. Let there be no mistake about the degree of difficulty of this undertaking, however. We are attempting something that has never been done before. But as with our original spectrum auctions 20 years ago, the risks are worth taking. Congress made the right call when it authorized the agency to conduct an incentive auction in the 600 megahertz band. We will get it right. But allow me to pause here for a moment for a commercial message. Change is difficult, especially when your business, in this case the broadcast business, provides a valuable national service, but does so in an environment in which increasingly over-the-air is only one of the platforms available to distribute video. When Congress created the broadcast incentive auction in 2012, it was recognizing that spectrum allocated on analog technical principles for analog business models may no longer be preferable for businesses in the digital age. The wisdom of its decision, and I use that word purposefully. It was wise. The wisdom of that decision was to let the market, rather than lawyers or Washington wise men, make spectrum allocation decisions through an incentive auction. But for an auction to be successful, there must be a willing buyer and a willing seller. In this case, it begins with the sellers, those presently owning broadcast licenses. The auction is a huge opportunity for those broadcasters who want to capture the value of their spectrum. Now, discussions to this point have seemed to focus on those broadcasters who may find it attractive simply to sell their spectrum and exit the business. Obviously, such a decision would expedite the auction process. But there are other options that are presented by the auction as well, and one of these I want to just quickly visit with you about today. One of these is for broadcasters to bolster their balance sheets, reduce capital expenditures, reduce operating expenditures, continue their traditional business by sharing a channel with other broadcasters and then selling the one that they vacate. Broadcast licenses are 6 megahertz wide. It's the old amount of spectrum needed to translate and to transmit an analog waveform. A digital television channel, however, does not require the full 6 megahertz of spectrum. In the new digital environment, that 6 megahertz of spectrum can deliver 19.4 megabits of throughput, far more than is necessary to transmit a standard definition or even a high definition TV channel. And this means that the 6 megahertz of spectrum once required for a single analog television channel now provides sufficient capacity for multiple television signals to coexist comfortably. The FCC is changing its rules to allow broadcast licensees to share capacity inside that 6 megahertz, maintain their broadcast carriage rights with cable systems, which after all are 90% of the homes that they reach, and walk off with a big check from selling their old spectrum. I cannot remember a point in history when it has been simpler, safer, or more profitable for an incumbent service provider to take advantage of new technology. Typically, new technology plows under the old business models. In this case, however, the FCC is overseeing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for profitable repurposing of an important business activity. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This is not hyperbole. The rebanding of the spectrum will mean that it will take place as a result of this auction, will mean that there will not be the ability to do it again. There will not be another round of broadcast incentive auctions. And of course, it would be unreasonable to ask broadcasters to make decisions of this magnitude without adequate information about the reverse auction. More information in that regard will be forthcoming in the next few months, beginning on January 30th, the end of this month. So why do I pause for this commercial message in the middle of a Silicon Valley speech? Well, one reason is to speak publicly to my friends in the broadcasting business about their once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But the other is to highlight for those in this valley who may have designs on using spectrum that their business models depend on helping others see the digital opportunity for their broadcast business. And while we're talking about the incentive auction, it's also important to emphasize that the accompanying rebanding will include additional allocations for unlicensed use. One of the FCC's great success stories was the creation of unlicensed uses in the 2.4 gigahertz band in the 1980s. Who would have imagined that Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and so many other innovations would result? Unlicensed is home for innovation. And we must make sure that there are enough homes for that innovation to flourish. This, of course, presumes that there will be sufficient amounts of broadcast spectrum put on the market. And the final point I'd like to make about spectrum, and I'll be brief on this point for now, is that spectrum management needs to evolve. Existing practices have served us well, but are still rooted in analog concepts. More dynamic use of spectrum compels us to innovate in spectrum management. Two groups, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, led by the Bay Area's Mark Gorenberg, sitting right here, and the FCC's Technological Advisory Council have been out front on this topic. These groups have made important proposals that go to the FCC's core role as the keeper of the master zoning chart, zoning map, that allows different technologies to exist in the radio spectrum. We're actively working on these ideas, and I'm particularly focused on spectrum sharing in the 3.5 gigahertz band, which is what Mark and the PCAST report recommended, and which I believe has the opportunity to be the launch pad for the next generation of spectrum policy. So the second policy area in which the FCC addresses risk to technology-fueled economic growth concerns the transitions to an all-IP network. This is important in its own right, but it also is important because it demonstrates that the Commission will adapt its regulatory approach to the networks and markets of the 21st century. The FCC derives its jurisdiction from statutes that were enacted in the analog age. Those laws tend to be organized, understandably enough, in terms of the categories that existed at the time of their origin. But they contain timeless values, encapsulated in what I call the Network Compact. Preserving those values in new technological circumstances is the work of the IP transitions. Notice that I use the word plural, transitions. Circuit switching will be replaced by more efficient networks made of fiber or copper or wireless. And such greater efficiency in networks can translate into greater innovation and greater benefits for network operators and users alike. Here, too, we can confront risk that could slow technological advances. For instance, not very many people would want to rely on a network that wouldn't allow them to make a 911 call. That's why the best way to speed technology transitions is to incent network innovation while preserving the enduring values that consumers and businesses have come to expect. Those values are familiar: public safety, interconnection, competition, consumer protection, and of course, universal access. They're familiar and they're fundamental. The FCC has a responsibility to both speed this transition in order to accelerate economic growth and to protect those values that network users have a right to expect from their networks. At the January 30 Commission meeting, we will propose a plan to invite proposals for a series of experiments utilizing all IP networks. We hope and expect that many proposed experiments, wired and wireless, will be forthcoming. Those experiments will allow the networks, their users, the FCC, and the public to assess the impact and potential for all IP networks. The third and final policy topic for our discussion today is the importance of the open internet. Broadband networks are essential to our national well-being. Last month, I released an ebook called Net Effects, which is available for free on Amazon and other outlets. And Net Effects talks about how broadband networks have the potential to be even more important than their historical antecedents. Broadband networks are notable for their high fixed cost and very large minimum efficient scale. And that means that at least at the local level, that opens the potential that there might not be many competing networks in any given area. Such a situation, of course, raises the distinct possibility that the owners and operators of such networks possess at least some local market power. The very possibility is sufficient to sustain this conclusion. It is essential in the public interest that our government, and by our government I mean the FCC, have the power to oversee broadband networks and to intervene to forestall their exploitation by unacceptable acts. What we call the internet is not a singular thing, but rather a collection of wired and wireless networks using a common protocol. The essential component of this collection is that the networks interconnect. In the internet world, such activity is called peering, but it's just a new name for an old concept of the benefits of networks connecting with one another. And just as interconnection is important, so is openness. It is important to learn from history that, as well as to establish a policy construct that says that openness is a desired criterion for our new 21st century networks. Not unlike how the radio networks of the 1920s needed to be protected from technical interference, today's entrepreneurs need to have a fair opportunity to reach their customers over the biggest technological channel of them all, the internet. Public policy should protect the great driving force of the open internet. And that great force is how the internet allows innovation without permission. That's why it's essential that the FCC continue to maintain an open internet and to maintain the legal ability to intervene promptly and effectively in the event of aggregated circumstances. No one in this valley needs to be convinced of the importance for innovation and overall societal welfare of our broadband networks. Keeping them open for any and all lawful purposes is a major policy imperative. And I draw from that three obvious implications. First, I support the Commission's open internet decision, which has helped preserve the internet as an open platform for innovation and expression and has increased certainty and predictability in the marketplace. Second, I support common law-like approaches to discerning the difference between appropriate and inappropriate broadband network conduct. In other words, the very general principles found in the open internet order should be reduced to, I love this word, justiciable practices. Practices you can do something about, on the basis of facts arising from specific circumstances. And third, the pursuit of legitimate private gain may not be sufficient to meet the national interest in the creation of robust broadband networks in all parts of America. That's not a failing of business, but it is, I think, a responsibility of government to assure that open access not only means getting on the network, but getting to the network. The necessity for these policies and the wisdom of a case-specific approach to implementing them is demonstrated by a coincidental occurrence earlier this week. AT&T announced the mobile service offering that enables subscribing firms to cover the airtime costs of accessing their content. Based in part on the premise that consumers have more choice for mobile wireless service than for fixed, the open internet order did not discourage this type of two-sided market for mobile uses. It also made clear, however, that the Commission would monitor these types of developments carefully. This seems to me to be the right approach. It may well be that the kind of offering AT&T has announced enables increased competition and increased efficiency, both things that benefit consumers. It is not the sort of thing that should be prohibited out of hand. But again, history instructs us that not all new proposals have been benign. There has to be some ability on the part of government to oversee, to assess, and if warranted, to intervene. Let me be clear about this. I am not advocating intervention unless there is an unmistakable warrant for it. I am not interested in protecting competitors from competition, nor am I interested in presiding over some festival of rent-seeking. But I am committed to maintaining our networks as conduits for commerce, large and small, as factors of production for innovative services and products, and for channels of all of the forms of speech permitted by the First Amendment. We will not let those things be impaired. This is closely related to competition policy, of course. Competitive markets produce outcomes that regulated or uncompetitive, better outcomes than regulated or uncompetitive markets. We must protect competition where it exists. We must promote competition where it may not be fulsome. But where significant, persistent market power exists or where significant negative externalities exist, FCC intervention may well be warranted. And of course, we will exercise with care our duty to ensure that new transactions do not create market concentration in regulated industries that would impair the public interest. Let me conclude with a request. You should think of these remarks, I hope, as the start of a dialogue. Moving forward, I invite your active participation in the activities at the FCC. Tell us what you know. Tell us what you think. Tell us what you think we should do. I've discussed today 3 important areas of policy: spectrum, the IP transitions, and the open internet. We want you to be involved. Every action the FCC takes or declines to take has consequences. If you want those consequences to be positive, you should participate with your insights about technology and the kind of ecosystem most conducive to technological progress and dynamism. It is not too much to say that the future depends on it. Every day, the tech sector pushes the bounds of what is possible. And yet, I believe the greatest discoveries still lie ahead. I look forward to working with you to realize the promise of the 4th network revolution and to strengthen our economy and to improve the lives of the American people. Thank you very much for your hospitality.
I want to start, before we explore a little further what you were talking about, I want to start with your record as a historian. I happen to have here,
Oh, good. More commercials.
I happen to have 2 books. One is maybe especially appropriate for today, Leadership Lessons from the Civil War. But this is Tom's book, which he wrote on leadership and some extremely colorful stories about leadership taken from the war. And then this is one which clearly you are drawing from as you think about your network strategy. This is Mr. Lincoln's T-mails. And if you haven't read this, I really encourage you to do it. Its subtitle is The Untold Story of How Abraham Lincoln Used the Telegraph to Win the Civil War. And you have overtones of the learning that clearly is reflected in this book throughout your speech. And I want to ask you first, from the standpoint of someone who is both a historian and also now a policymaker, what is it about that part of your background that you've taken forward in this new role as the chairman of the FCC?
Well, you know, John, as I said, you were a senior member of the FCC staff when you and I first met, and it is a mistake for policymakers to think that somehow they exist in a vacuum. We have been here before. The thing that fascinates me about these 3 previous network revolutions that I reference in my comments is that what was happening at that point in time in terms of economic development, in terms of societal response is very similar to what's happening today as a result of the new networks. And what gets very exciting about the work that we're doing at the FCC is that in the midst of this network revolution, where the network that defines who we are is changing so rapidly, we, the FCC, have a chance to kind of sit there and say, okay, how do I make sure, not that I guide the network, but as I said, that we maintain this network compact, that the values that people have always expected about networks maintain and are maintained and continue. And that's worth getting up for in the morning. But they're not, and the issues are not different. You know, if you go back to the last great network revolution, 150 years ago, the combination of the telegraph and the railroad, it produced economic dislocation. It produced great upheaval. You could argue it produced the Civil War. And it produced incredible opportunity. That's what we exist in right now.
How do you find the dialogue in Washington around these issues? You sit in a position where you hear so many different perspectives from so many different sides, when it seems, as you alluded to in your speech, the conditions for policymaking are changing ever more rapidly. How do you begin to wrap your arms around something like that?
Well, I think challenge number one is to begin to understand what the new technology looks like. You know, we still all think in analog terms. I mean, our lives are still defined by the last great revolution. And so an education process where policymakers begin to see the possibilities and the differences. I'll give you an example. Years ago, when the spectrum shortage first came on the scene, I used to go around to Congress and talk about this really important thing called spectrum. Now let me pause and tell you what it is. It's the airwaves, and this is how we communicate, and there's data that's soon going to be moving across it and this sort of thing. And I had to sit there and kind of walk people through, and they're, you know, okay, well, that's interesting. When I was making the rounds of the United States Senate prior to my confirmation, there was hardly a single senator who didn't begin the discussion by saying, I want to talk to you about spectrum. And so there's an education process that is going on that the new networks are driving, and that's an important part. And so inside that education process, there is debate. So I have a poster hanging on the wall of my office from 1839 that was a poster in Philadelphia by the folks who were opposing the railroads interconnecting and coming to town. And the headline is, "Women and Children, Watch Out!" Okay? And it shows a drawing of a mad locomotive racing through the middle of town, and carriages are being thrown this way, and women are scurrying with their children away from it. And it was paid for by the interests who would be affected by the fact that the railroads were now going to interconnect, and you weren't going to need haulage companies, and you weren't going to need freight forwarders, and you weren't going to need sundry sellers and things like this. Never disclosed. But this kind of debate is exactly what we're going through right now. And so the importance of history to me is that we need to understand that it has always thus been so. You know, we saw a classic example of people exhibiting their First Amendment right to have an opinion and to speak their opinion today on something that is a new thing that people have not yet, in many cases, become comfortable with. This is a part and parcel of a network revolution.
You talked about a couple of things specifically that I would just like for you to give a little background to in this audience. There's some obviously very knowledgeable people who follow the specific issues you're talking about, but then this is entirely new to a whole other group of people. And I would like for you to maybe talk for a second about this IP transition issue that the Commission is going through now, and just explain, perhaps in layman's terms, what that relates to, because I think we all It's like your story about senators understanding spectrum. I think we all, at some level, understand IP today and how it drives this network that we depend on. But what is the transition exactly?
So, since Alexander Graham Bell, the telephone network, the principal network connecting us, has been what's called a switch circuit. Remember when you used to, you don't remember, but I'm sure you saw movies, right?
See, thanks, Tom. I'm glad you pointed that out.
Crank the phone and, Maud, connect me with John.
Right, yeah.
That call went to a switch where somebody pulled a wire and stuck it in another hole that went to your wire. And that's the way the telephone network has worked ever since then. It's been systematized, it's been made electronic, and lots of improvements, and Maud has moved on. But that's the basis of the telephone network as we know it today. And that's going away. Because in the world of internet protocol, there is no difference in form factor between a telephone call and Angry Birds. Okay? There's a big difference in importance, okay? And a 911 call is a lot more important than Angry Birds. And so the question becomes, how do you make sure that as we're making the transition to these new internet protocol-based networks, that are all zeros and ones, that basic things such as the ability to call 911 and basic concepts that we have had for the last 150 years with the telephone continue in place? There are those who say, well, you know, we're going to be IP, and so therefore there's no need for the government at all in this. This should be a government-free zone, regulation-free zone. What we're going to be doing the 30th of this month is laying out an agenda for a series of field trials to be run by major network providers where they will switch from an analog switch circuit switch system to an all IP so that we can monitor what are the effects, so that we can understand what are the things that need to be done when this actually affects everybody. Because at some point in time, just like 5 years ago, at some point in time, 5 years ago we switched to digital television. And at some point in time in the not too distant future, we're going to have to be switching to digital networks.
So you would compare it to that kind of transition, something that is that transformational for those of us who are average viewers of television, average users of networks for whatever reason. That's very fundamental.
It's that big a deal.
Yeah.
And it's transformational for those who run the networks because it's a lot less expensive to build internet protocol networks. And it's transformational for those who use it. I mean, the reason why you can get a plethora of video information on multiple devices is because of what the IP revolution has enabled.
You're the first FCC chairman in a long time to be holding a large series of small town hall meetings around the country where you're going to hear about these issues. It's interesting to me that you're going to create a forum where
for this,
anyone who wants to talk to you about any issue at all will be able to do that.
I mean, look, despite certain allegations, I see my job here as being the representative of the American people. You know, I had for many years, I was very fortunate. At one point in time, I represented the cable television industry in its nascent years. And another time, I represented the mobile industry in its nascent years. I was their advocate. I thought I was a pretty good advocate for them. Today, my client is the American people. And I'm going to do the best damn job that I can. And part of that means I want to hear what people say. I was genuine when I said, hey, folks, let's make this a dialogue.
Right. Let's switch gears for a minute. Let's talk about managing spectrum auctions. This is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, it's happened for a number of years, but in governmental terms, if you look at the life of communications regulation, this is a pretty new thing. What has the FCC learned about the auction process. What makes an effective and successful auction? How does a process like this really work out, not only so that it does what you're trying to do in policy terms, but it's good from the public interest standpoint?
You want to have, you want to put into place the ability to use this new pathway called spectrum as much as possible on both licensed and unlicensed bases. And you want to make that opportunity as open and competitive as possible. And let me explain this broadcast, this incentive auction for a second. It's kind of like a Rubik's Cube. You know how Rubik's Cube has 3 moving parts. I could never do one, but now I'm running an auction that I'm supposed to. But anyway, but the first one here is going to be, we have to buy spectrum from broadcasters. The other side of the cube is we've got to then resell that spectrum to mobile operators. And the middle section of the cube is, in order to create something that can be used, we have to reband it. So, because these are apples and oranges as they stand today, and we've got to move them into a format that can be used. And so we're buying, selling, and reorganizing simultaneously. And when somebody backs out and says, oop, I don't want to sell it after all, then it changes all of this in the middle, which changes this over here. And we're doing this all in real time. It's never been done before in history. When it works, it will revolutionize the way in which the world looks at how do I allocate spectrum. Because suddenly, economic forces will be able to determine the highest and best use, rather than, as I said, wise men and women sitting around Washington and consulting their Ouija boards and saying this is the way it should be done.
Another question about the last few days. You're coming off your first appearance as commissioner, as the chairman of the commission at the Consumer Electronics Show. I've got a 2-part question for you. You've been going to CES for many years. Did you look at CES differently this year with the new lens that you have?
That's a great question.
And the second one is, what did you see as a consumer or as a policymaker that excited you?
That's a great question. There's 2 million square feet of exhibit space, I was told yesterday at CES. And in the years past, I would kind of, wander around like this.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I got taken through. It's a whole lot nicer way of seeing things. But they said, what do you want to see? And I said, I want to see 2 things. I want to see wireless applications, and I want to see applications that are using digital technologies to attack the challenges of individuals with disabilities. And because I think that one of the real important things that we have in this network revolution is to make sure that there is accessibility for individuals with disabilities, and that we're using the new network to create things that couldn't previously exist to attack some of the challenges of individuals with disabilities. And so we looked at those. So there was an iPad-based Braille coding system, which was fabulous. There were televisions that had voice response and voice descriptions. So what I'm saying, I think that there are all kinds of really exciting things that come out of this revolution once we go to an all-digital environment that can attack not just the obvious things, but also the challenges that some groups of us in this society face. And I find that really exciting, and I hope that's one of the things that we'll be focusing on at the FCC during my tenure.
I've got one or two more questions. We've got time for about 2 more. Let me just ask these. You alluded to the fact that Washington doesn't really always understand Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley doesn't always understand Washington. For those of us who've spent time in both places, we certainly have witnessed that.
Right.
What can be done about that? Is that an important thing to try to take on? Is there a bridge that has to be built between entrepreneurs, investors, innovators, people who are out here doing the Silicon Valley thing, and everyone in Washington who's looking after the issues you and others have to look after?
I think that's a really good point, John. And again, I was asking, hopefully today, that we can have an ongoing dialogue. But yes, I don't think the two worlds don't really understand each other. That the high-risk concept that exemplifies the Valley is not the concept in Washington. Likewise, the concept in Washington of needing to look at things in a broader construct is not the concept in the Valley, which is how do I take and parse markets down into ever smaller pieces. So there's a disconnect in general that exists because of that. But I think we need each other. We can't, just speaking for ourselves, we can't deliver the spectrum that is essential for the success of the operations in this valley and for service to Americans without the support of the people in this valley. Because the story has to be told that, there is a use for this spectrum that can deliver this kind of promise. And therefore, we need to think about how we get there. But that story has to be told. I can't tell that story. But the people in this valley can tell that story. The opportunities that exist for a broadcaster to say, I'm going to repurpose my business away from the way it's always been. I can keep running it that way, but I can also seize on new digital opportunities. They've got to be helped to understand what those new digital technologies are and how they work. And this valley can do that story.
And is the open internet the type of issue that will drive that dialogue even further, do you see? Because the internet obviously is so dominant here in the business models and the thinking, the innovation of what's happening from San Francisco to San Jose and everywhere in between. Is this the issues that will be kind of the galvanizing moment when these sides begin to come together and really engage in what can happen?
Well, it's interesting. The Open Internet Order was enacted a couple of years ago by my predecessor, Julius Janikowski, and it was appealed by Verizon to the D.C. Circuit Court. And literally, momentarily, we're expecting a decision from the court on that. And that's a decision that will take place in Washington that will have huge ramifications out here. And my message is that we stand firm for the concept of an open internet, that we believe we have the authority to deal with assuring that there is an open internet, and that the economic growth, the expansion of services, the creation of jobs, all depend on the existence of an open internet. I think that maybe there has been at least back on the other coast, there's been a feeling that, okay, the Open Internet Order was put out, sure it's being appealed, the Valley moved on. This is a bread and butter issue. This is a crucial issue. And I want to emphasize, yes, I'm here in the Valley talking about this. But we're talking about something that affects every single American. And what's significant about what happens in the Valley is not the development itself, but it's the effect of that development. It's what that development means. It's how students can use new technology to get a 21st century education. It's how my life productivity increases because of the things that I can do wirelessly. It's how individuals with disabilities can deal with some of their challenges by applying a new technology that didn't exist heretofore. It's these kinds of effects that affect all Americans, which are what's important that comes out of the Valley.
Let me ask you a question about how you do your job as the chairman of the FCC. You've been involved in every other dimension you could possibly be involved in when you think about policymaking in the telecommunications area, building businesses, investing, representing cable, cellular, et cetera. And now there you are in the chairman's office every day, and you are distinctly on the other side of the desk. What's it like? How's it different? Is it what you expected? Is it sort of what you observed in seeing chairman of the commission over the years, or is it kind of the uniquely Tom Wheeler experience?
You know, John, there are days when it is actually spooky because I'm sitting in my office and I think of the times that I was in that office when it was occupied by others, and I was in there this is the way it's got to be done, and this is the only revealed truth is right here, do it my way. And I think that actually helps me. I keep saying this is not my first rodeo, okay? And I think having seen policy development from the other side increases my ability to discern and make decisions. At least I hope it does.
That's great. Let me ask you one final question about how you're dealing with the blurring of lines. You know, you alluded in your speech that broadcasters are not broadcasters anymore solely. They've got other means of reaching their audiences. Sony announced a cloud television service at CES. Satellite companies are delivering the internet. You know, and the litany just goes on and on and on. What challenges does the blurring of these lines and the sort of the crossing over of non-regulated and regulated businesses and just every other kind of new complexity been introduced into this, what does that do to policymaking in 2014?
So I think we've moved regulatory models. The old regulatory model was one that was proscriptive. And you had business and regulatory policy divided into a series of silos. There were the broadcasters, there were the telephone companies, there were all these other silos. And you pretty much knew what was going to be developing inside those silos. And so policymakers could be very proscriptive in terms of what would happen inside those silos. Today, two things have happened. One is the silos don't exist. Zeros and ones have made everything the same. And second is you have no idea what the innovations are going to be. That we live in an innovation economy, and the ideas that are developing out there are moving so rapidly, you could never keep up with them. So you try to develop a regulatory philosophy that says, I'm going to let the market be innovative and let the market be experimental, and I'm going to carefully watch because I've got specific consumer protection, competition protection, responsibilities, and authority that will be exercised. And so I keep talking about it in terms of what I call the regulatory seesaw. Okay, that if things are competitive, if the industry is doing the kinds of things out here that make sense, or that flow from competition, then there's not much need for regulation. But this seesaw can go both ways. I'll give you an example. My second week on the job, the matter of being able to unlock cell phones and whether after your contract is expired, that phone is yours or you're still tied to the carrier. That's something that the FCC and the wireless industry had been working around and talking about for months. And I called the CEO of CTIA my second week on the job, and I said, Steve, we've been talking about this for 8 months. We're going to solve this by this date, which happened to be a month away. And if you don't have it solved by then, I will. And the industry stepped forward, and they exhibited the kind of leadership, and phone unlocking is now becoming a standard practice in the industry. And I think we need to have that kind of approach, which is I can't be as smart as the marketplace can be, but I know what those values are. And if the marketplace won't give us those values, then we have no concern about stepping in and doing it ourselves.
Do you expect, are there those scenarios you can see coming down the road? You don't have to get into specifics, obviously, but are there going to be those moments where that sort of crystal clarity is going to come in handy, is going to sort of cut some of these Gordian knots that continually get tied in Washington?
That conversation has been had with other industries, shall we say.
Very good. Well, Tom, I want to thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for your great hospitality and for the fabulous institution that you run here, John.
Well, it's quite poetic that you began with Charles Babbage, because now we're going to go downstairs and see
and watch it crack it out.
The working Babbage engine number 2 do its thing. So thank you, Tom. And now I have the gavel, and it remains only to me to say that this joint meeting of the Computer History Museum and the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco is now concluded.
Thank you, John.